It must be understood that while Xilian and Huacheng saw Mingyi as suspicious, Mingyi thought them equally suspicious. From the moment Mingyi struck, they had been speaking aloud rather than using the communication array. Shi Qingxuan didn't know what they were arguing about, but he didn't dare remove his earplugs rashly and could only attempt to intervene. Stop, stop, stop! I order you all to stop right now and tell me what happened, or else I'm gonna butt in too! He flashed open his Windmaster fan. Mingyi shoved him aside. Move! Stop adding to the trouble! Just then, a blast of sinister wind blew from out of nowhere. The flames of the small campfire they were gathered around quivered and danced wildly with the gust. Silhouettes and shadows twisted and contorted with the firelight, making the two divine statues on the altar appear extremely unsettling. Smiling but not. Crying but not. Mingyi pulled Shi Qingxuan up. Something's here, he said warily. He had moved Shi Qingxuan to the ground without warning. It had pulled him up just as quickly. Shi Qingxuan was dizzy and seeing stars. Mingxiong, can you please be nicer to me? No time, Mingyi said. Xilian had been watching the two statues and urged the others, look at their eyes! The four looked over and saw that the smiling faces of the two divine statues were streaked with vivid red lines. Their clay eyes streamed bloody tears. Divine statues which had been sanctified in ceremonies and worshipped by believers possessed a certain power to deter evil. Even if said evil didn't completely retreat, the statues still typically couldn't be defiled by inhuman hands. The Reverend of Empty Words was certainly powerful. Shi Qingxuan was here in the flesh, yet it made the statue of the Wind Master weep bloody tears before the god himself. The tears of blood seemed thicker and heavier, dripping to the ground and gathering into a twisted, complex form. Shi Qingxuan was bewildered. What is that thing? Is it drawing a picture? He couldn't figure out what the shape was forming, no matter how he looked at it. He didn't move closer, but he tried to look at it from various angles to discern the image. Xilian snapped out of his shock to realize that it wasn't a drawing. It was an upside-down word. Don't look, he barked. It's written for you! Mingyi struck out with his palm. Boom. The blood-streaked ground, and two divine statues were blasted to pieces. Shi Qingxuan's jaw dropped. Mingxiong, you can't let my brother know about this, or he'll never forgive you. To destroy a heavenly official's divine statue was an act of extreme disrespect. And today, Mingyi had snapped an establishment plaque in half, and then blasted two statues to bits. This was no different than crashing someone's restaurant, smashing their signage, and then soundly slapping the owner in the face. If this got out, specifically if the person in question found out, they wouldn't sit back and do nothing. Who knew what kind of bloody storm would rise from it? As Xilian idly turned his head, he noticed that the broken plaque they had set aside earlier in the day didn't seem quite right. The establishment plaque was painted blue and had proper golden characters spelling the words Temple of Wind and Water. But now the strokes of the characters were twisted into bloody red shapes that appeared to be the beginning of the word death. In a flash, he covered Shi Qingxuan's eyes and yelled in the communication array, Close your eyes! What now? Shi Qingxuan shouted back. Nothing. It's just that the words in your establishment plaque have changed. The creature knows you can't hear it, so it's trying to write, Xilian explained. Damn! Shi Qingxuan exclaimed. If I can't let myself hear or see anything, then aren't I both deaf and blind? Xilian dropped his hands. Don't worry, just calm down. We're here for you. Mingyi grabbed hold of Shi Qingxuan's back collar, and dragged him aside. Shi Qingxuan still had his eyes closed, and he put his palms together as if in prayer. How reassuring! Just as he spoke, an enormously noisy commotion came from outside the rundown temple. Dark blurs darted across Xilian's vision, and in the next moment there was a huge, rowdy crowd of people howling like devils and pouring inside like a pitch-black tide. It was a mob populated by all kinds of bizarre forms and monstrous shapes. Some had decapitated heads, some were hanged, some had large sabers piercing their skulls, some had their bellies cut open. There were all sorts of violent curiosities. Shi Qingxuan couldn't hear and see, but he could feel the disorderly, chaotic footsteps all around him. He was even pushed around in the ruckus. What's going on? He asked in the communication array, bewildered. What's gotten inside? Why are there so many people? It's nothing major, Xilian said. It's that night parade of the Bloody Fire Social. Let's just get out of here. In some places, Bloody Fire Socials would hold further entertainment well into the night after the day's parades had ended. Not only did the performers want to get their fill of scaring people, many common folk also had the urge to do the same, and so they would imitate the Bloody Fire Social's terrifying makeup and use the dark of night to head out and look for people to scare. Unfortunately, the four of them seemed to have run into such a group of night cruisers. The rowdy crowd of common folk didn't have the same level of realism to their makeup as the proper parade troops, but they were nevertheless formidable due to sheer numbers and terrifyingly obscured by the darkness of the night. Quite the sight to behold. In towns that had such after-hours entertainments during bloody fire socials, locals would lock up their homes tightly and stay indoors. These night cruisers had been wandering around for some time, and they were quite excited when they saw there were people inside the broken shrine, as if they'd spotted prey. Over 50 of them had charged in, overcrowding the small temple. The 4 of them were drowned in the pandemonium. Shilian kept looking back, but he could only see Huocheng, who was still next to him and never more than 2 steps out of reach. The other 2 were pushed several meters away. "Everyone, let's get outside now!" he shouted. But while some of the night cruisers were purely there for fun, others were small-time merchants there specifically to scam petty change from tourists who had come to watch the bloody fire social. They blocked them inside, not letting them leave, and began to pester and cajole them. "Young masters, give us a tip! We worked so hard to dress up. If you had fun tonight, then give us a tip. Yeah, it ain't easy, and this is only a once-a-year thing. If you don't tip us, watch out for the old ghost lord who'll come hunt you." Since the whole affair had nothing to do with him, Huocheng only watched from the sidelines and wasn't the least bit anxious. When he heard them, he laughed out loud. "I'd like to see what kind of ghosts dare come knocking on my door." As Shilian swept a look over the crowd, he saw a pale-faced, hanged ghost near the edge of the crowd. It was wrapping a rope around someone's neck, while wearing an eerie grin. It was chaos all around. Everyone was covered in blood, their faces contorted, endlessly playing out games of you kill me, I kill you, now you're dead, now I'm dead. People were constantly howling and falling over. It was hard to differentiate the real from the fake, but Shilian's instincts told him that person wasn't right, and he threw out his arm. Roya flew forth and struck the hanged ghost squarely on the head. Sure enough, the hanged ghost wailed and turned into a wisp of black smoke, fleeing through a small crack in the ground. No one else noticed, but Shilian saw everything clearly. "Everyone be careful! Something wicked is mixed in with the crowd," he warned in the communication array. There now seemed to be a faint ghost chi wafting within the Temple of Wind and Water. It wasn't from the Reverend of Empty Words, of course, but more likely some little minions that had snuck into the crowd at some point. When people play around and pretend to be ghosts, it doesn't take long to attract real ones. But for them to show up right now really was adding frost to snow. There were too many people and too much chaos in the temple. Heads knocked heads, feet stepped on feet, and it was too difficult to determine the exact source of the ghost chi. Shilian grabbed Huocheng and ran out of the Temple of Wind and Water. He was about to ask for the others, but found he couldn't. His spiritual powers was almost depleted, and with no power, he couldn't enter the communication array. In that moment of urgency, he turned to Huocheng. "Sanlang, lend me a bit of spiritual power. I'll pay you back later." Of course, the promise of later payment was nonsense. He was never able to pay back any of the power he borrowed. "All right," Huocheng said, then reached out to hold Shilian's hand. Shilian felt a burst of warmth pass into his palm. In that moment, a few bloody individuals came rushing out of the temple in hot pursuit. The one staggering behind that group was drooping innards, and as he ran, the skin that crawled with living and had skin that crawled with liver mortis. He also gave off a faint aura of ghost chi. Without thinking, Shilian shot a blast from his palm. A booming sound like an explosion was heard, and a blinding white light flashed. It took a while before Shilian realized what had happened. In the place where the ghost with the cut belly once stood, only a mound of black ash-like residue remained. As for the Temple of Wind and Water, the entire rooftop had been blown away. The rioting night cruisers in the temple had gone still, frozen in shock from the booming sound and blinding light. Shilian raised his head to look at the Temple of Wind and Water, now missing its roof, then looked down at his own hand. Finally, he slowly turned to look at Huocheng, who stood behind him. Huocheng smiled. "Was that enough?" "It was," Shilian said. "Actually, really just a little bit would have been fine." "That was a little bit," Huocheng assured him. "Do you want more? You can have as much as you want." Shilian quickly shook his head. In the past, he also borrowed spiritual powers from Shi Qingquan, Nanfeng, and others. They lent very generously, but Shilian had never experienced a feeling like this, as if all the blood in his veins had turned into an electrical current that charged through his body. The powers he'd borrowed before had to be economized and saved, only one bite taken at a time, for fear of wasting them. Right now, he felt like he could eat a full bowl and dump out 10 without a care. The power Huocheng had passed to him was too great. It filled his entire body to bursting. It was to the point where Shilian was almost afraid to move, scared that with just a wave of his hand something else nearby would explode. Now that their surroundings were temporarily calm, he hurriedly entered the communication array. Lord Windmaster, where are you? I left the temple, but I don't see you. Oh, God, Shi Qingxuan groaned inside the communication array. Your Highness, why is your voice so loud all of a sudden? I left the Temple of Wind and Water, too. Shi Lian reined in his spiritual powers, then replied, Sorry, I'm having some trouble controlling this. How did you leave? Are you all right? After all, right now Shi Qingxuan had his ears plugged and his eyes closed. How else could I have left? Mingcheng pulled me out. Thank goodness I wasn't trampled to death by that crowd, Shi Qingxuan said. A moment later, Mingyi's voice also sounded in the spiritual communication array. However, his words froze the smile that was just beginning to form on Shi Lian's face. That wasn't me, Mingyi said. It wasn't. Shi Lian snapped his head around. Oh no. Lord Windmaster, just who was it that pulled you away? And that is chapter 54.